are on page 894. So, a couple of things about the rainforest. Actually, the rainforest is on 892. Stuff they might ask you on the AP exam. The rainforest has all this living material. Has all this what we call biomass. It's got the greatest amount of biomass. It's got the most production, which is photosynthesis happening, because it's got the hottest and the most water. But another thing about the rainforest that you wouldn't expect is that it has very poor soil. The soil is non-nutritious. And that's a good trick question, because you would expect it to be nutritious. And they like to ask you questions that you should know, and the regular guy taking the test wouldn't know. So why is the soil so poor? It's because all this living material pulls all of the nutrients out of the soil and up into the trees and bodies of the plants. And if you ever have a dead leaf fall down and land on the ground, instead of decomposing, it's picked up real quickly by insects and stuff that eat leaves. So you never are returning much of the nutrition to the soil. Everything's pulled out of the soil.
But how do trees get their nutrition?
Well, they got it from the soil, but now the soil is depleted.
It's unsustainable now, pretty much?
Well, it would be sustainable if a tree falls, some of its nutrients are going to return to the soil. Not all of it will be eaten. And you'll probably be able to eventually grow new trees there. But the problem in the rainforest are that people are cutting down the rainforest, cutting this material, and trying to plant crops in the cleared forest. And like I say, the soil is not very nutritious, so they can only plant crops for a year or two. And then they have to move on to the next bit.
So it's kind of a waste of resources.
It is. But there's no choice for a lot of these people who it's either grow food to feed your family or let your family die. What are you going to do? You're going to try to grow food. So, that's the main reason why the rainforests are disappearing. Because people are cutting these, it's called slash and burn. They cut the forest, they put all the material to the side and burn it. And you basically lose all the nutrient value of the forest there when you do that. This area are shrub lands. That's the next biome that they talk about on page 894. A shrub land is an area that doesn't really have enough rainfall to support trees, but it has enough to support little shrubs, and so that's what we have here, little shrub land. In California, they call this chaparral. You may have heard of that. It's kind of like shrubland. It's highly flammable. It dries out. Like I say, there's not much rainfall, and it'll dry out at certain times of the year and then catch fire. And so areas that are shrubland have a lot of wildfires. It spreads out, and it'll kill the shrubs, but they'll grow back pretty quickly. Some of the seeds of these things will not germinate unless they're burned. So the fires are actually important in sustaining the ecosystem. Then you have your grasslands. And it shows some of the places where you have these big grasslands. Now, grasslands have very fertile soil. This is the most fertile soil anywhere, is the grasslands. Because the grasses grow up, and they die, and they decompose, and the soil stays very rich. There's not really enough rainfall to support a lot of trees. So you just get grasses. There's rainy seasons where it's good for growth. And you see a few scattered trees, but not many. And this is where a lot of farmland is. Like in the middle of the United States, right here, you can see where it's shaded. That's where all the big farms are. Where most of the food in the United States comes from. Because like I say, this is very fertile soil. You can plant crops on it, and they'll grow year after year. And so most of the food in the world comes from farms that have been put down in these grassland type areas. The animals are usually grazers. Grassland video footage.
Grasslands are typically found in the interiors of continents. These lands provide a natural pasture for herds of grazing animals such as bison and antelope. The soils of grasslands are very fertile due to the growth and decay of many plants. Burrowing animals such as prairie dogs, rabbits, and gophers are common in temperate grasslands.
Most of the animals there will hide in the ground when it gets too cold or predators come. There's not much other place to hide. In Africa, you have areas that are like grasslands. They're called savannas. And also South America here. But mostly you see this in Africa. This is like if you're watching The Lion King and you see all those animals spread out everywhere. We call that a savanna. Cool, dry season followed by a hot, rainy season. Large expanses of grasses with relatively few trees. One tree that can survive the severe dry season is the thorny flat-topped acacia, which sheds its leaves during the drought. So we got a lot of herbivores that go around eating the grasses in the savanna. And then you have the carnivores trying to eat the herbivores, and that's where you get all the lions out there chasing, and so forth. So that's a savanna. Savannah. Is that your favorite biome?
Yes, it is.
No, you don't like the tropical rainforest, huh? Okay. The desert is the area with the least rainfall. I think they say if it's less than 25 centimeters of rainfall a year, it's thought to be a desert. It's called scientifically known as a desert. That's about 10 inches of rain in a year, which is not very much. The desert. Most deserts are not like the Sahara Desert, where you just see all sand and nothing else. Most deserts have enough rain to support some plants. So if you drive out in the western U.S., and, where Las Vegas is and that kind of area, that's a desert, but this is what it looks like. It's got little plants. They're usually kind of spread out, because they'll spread out their roots kind of wide. And whenever it does rain, which is rare, but it happens, they'll get a lot of water because they have these roots spread way out. So you'll see a plant here, and then some space, and then a plant here. So each plant has enough area to pull in rainfall when it does happen. The animals that you see in the desert are very have ways of keeping in water. They're water tolerant. They can tolerate, I guess you could say they're dry tolerant. They can tolerate lack of water. So they operate off of. Do y'all remember what water of metabolism was? If you take in glucose, food, let's say you eat a little bit of leaf or some kind of plant or something, and it's got some glucose in it, and when that goes through your mitochondrions, combined with the oxygen that you breathe, it forms a little water. We call that the water of metabolism. And a lot of these animals can live just off that. And so they never drink, almost never, in their entire lives. Except maybe a few times when it rains. When it does rain, it's hard to collect water, but they can keep water in their body so well they don't lose it. They can operate off that water of metabolism. Desert video.
A desert is a region that receives less than 25 centimeters of rain a year. Vegetation in deserts is sparse and consists of cacti, sagebrush, and other plants with adaptations to hot, dry conditions. Reptiles such as snakes and lizards are common in deserts. These animals have a thick, waterproof skin and excrete dry waste materials, which helps conserve water.
Yeah, the reptiles do well. And the cactuses are plants that have adapted to keep water inside them. So if you're ever stuck in a desert and you happen to have a pocket knife or something, you might get in there and get some water out of cactus. The leaves have become adapted into these spines that protect the cactus. So the cactus doesn't do any photosynthesis with its leaves. The cactus does only photosynthesis with its stem, which is usually green and has some chloroplasts in it. But all the leaves are now spines that keep animals from getting it at its water. That's a pretty good system.
Mr. Willis,
Yeah.
real quick, when you're talking about animals that can retain water really well, like aren't most animals that retain water really well, aren't they small? Don't they have to be small?
Well, they have to be small because there's just not much water around to support big creatures.
What about like camels?
Yeah, camels can store water in their fat in their pumps. So they've found a way. Yeah. Even they have to get some water, though, every couple of weeks, I think. Yeah. Most of them secrete uric acid waste product, which doesn't require any water. Remember that? Okay, the next part, which I want to get into, I'm going to start this today and we'll end it tomorrow, because I also want to show you my rainforest pictures. And I can't seem to get them up on the computer, so I got to figure that out today. But anyway, let's talk about aquatic ecosystems on 897. Okay, so there's all sorts of aquatic ecosystems, and this kind of shows you an overview of all of them. Most of the water on the earth exists in the oceans. And ocean water is salt water. And why is the ocean salty? That's probably a good question. Anyone have any idea?
Came from space.
No, it comes from the rocks.
It does, yeah, very good. It comes from the rocks. What happens is, when the ocean evaporates, the water goes up into the air and forms clouds. Y'all seen clouds before, right? And the clouds blow over the land and rain down water. Now, the water will run off into streams and rivers and eventually run back into the ocean. A lot of the water does that. And as the water does that, it erodes the land. It slowly tears up the rock and brings tiny pieces of the rock with it into the ocean. You know what tiny pieces of rock are called?
Sediment.
Salt.
Mineral.
Sand is what we call
Yeah.
it. Sand. That's why the beaches are all sandy. It's come from the rocks. And along with that sand comes a lot of salt from the rocks. Rocks have salts in them. It's all called sediment, anything that piles up. So that's a correct answer too.
Silicon dioxide.
But so the salt was from the rocks originally, and now it ends up just floating around in the ocean. So the ocean water is very salty. But it takes millions of years for all that salt to build up. So when the rivers are moving along, that's pretty much fresh water. There's a little salt in it from the rocks that eroded, but not enough to notice. So a river is fresh water. Now the river, of course, lakes can form, big deposits of fresh water. Some streams run into lakes and form a big lake. And then there's also the water that seeps down into the soil and forms these aquifers that are underground. Just a bunch of water underground, groundwater. Usually those aquifers eventually run back into the ocean too. There's underwater where there's kind of a trickle that comes into the ocean.
Do any animals live in aquifers?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think it's clear, just clean water. It's water mixed with dirt and such. It's not like just pure water. It's not like an ocean under there. And I don't even think there's much bacteria in there. There might be, but when you stick a well and that water comes up, that's pretty pure stuff. So anyway, so those are the different aquatic. We have fresh water coming from where it rained, and we have salt water in the ocean. And between the two, we have these marshy areas, which get fresh water running off the land, but also there's intrusion of salt water when the tides go in and out. So a salt marsh, which is what we have here, is a combination of the two. There's a word for sort of half fresh, half salt water. Do y'all know what it is?
Brackish.
Brackish. Ooh, y'all knew that one. Very nice. And there's only a certain type of organism that can survive those brackish waters. And those are the marsh grasses that we see around here. And then some of the animals that live in those marshes. Marshes are very important in that most fish in the sea actually come into the marshes to lay their eggs. And the reason why is because the salt marsh is very productive. The salt marsh is like a rainforest in that it gets a lot of sunlight. It's got a lot of plant growth. The plants there grow very quickly and do a lot of photosynthesis. So it's the bottom of a very big food chain. And it's usually in a place that's a lot of sun because there's no shade there, you see. And so they're really growing fast in the salt marsh. And so there's grasses growing quickly, then there's little crabs and shrimp and things that are eating the grasses, and crabs and insects and things that are eating the grasses. And then the fish, the little baby fish, when they start growing, they eat those insects and such. And so it's the beginning of a big food chain. So if you want your babies to eat, you go, if you're a fish, you go lay your eggs in a salt marsh. So one reason why there's not nearly as many fish in the sea as there used to be, estimates are up to we've lost 90% of the fish in the sea in the last 200 years. You go back 200 years ago, there's 10 times more fish than there were now. And one of the reasons why is because we're losing these salt marshes where the fish lay their eggs. And one of the reasons why we're losing it is because people have filled in the salt marshes to build houses and such. is because the ocean is rising due to global warming, which we're going to talk about after the AP exam. When the oceans rise, they intrude on the salt marsh, you see. And what that would normally do is push the salt marsh backward. But behind the salt marsh, people have built roads and houses and such. And so it has nowhere to go, you see, so it just gets smaller. So this is one of the huge problems is facing the world. Since there's less fish in the ocean, then there's less food because people eat fish. Do you know fish used to be one of the cheapest ways to eat?
Oh, yeah.
You go back a couple hundred years, and only the poor people ate fish. Now fish is a delicacy. It's very expensive. There's a reason for that. It's harder to find. There used to be something like 1,500 shrimp boats in Georgia. And now there's like 300. The numbers have gone way down. This wasn't too long ago. My dad and I have to always tell stories about how we used to catch a lot of fish when we go offshore. He had a boat. Just don't catch them anymore. There's just not as many. And so that's just in my lifetime I've noticed. Or maybe the fish are getting smarter and they won't catch, they won't bite the bait. And there's something to that. I mean, that's evolution. If a fish evolves the ability, if it sees a line and it avoids that, it's not going to get caught. It'll have babies that, like its parents, avoid catching anything that has a line attached to it. And so the fish has evolved to become smarter. And I think that does happen. Now, a couple of words you need to know. If we're talking about lakes here, there are different types of lakes. Some lakes we call oligotrophic, and some lakes we call eutrophic. Now, an oligotrophic lake is a lake. It's usually a very pretty lake. The water is clear, and an oligotrophic lake basically doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it. Now, when I talk about nutrients, I'm not talking about food. In layman's terms, nutrients mean food, but in scientific terms, nutrients is talking about what? Minerals. What minerals in specific? Nitrogen? Phosphorus, very good. Maybe potassium? Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the three main minerals that are needed by plants to grow. If you ever order a bag of fertilizer, you'll see three numbers on it. It might say 20, 10, 20. And that's the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium levels that they have in that fertilizer. And if you just put those out on your field or on your lawn, the grass will grow really fast. It makes a huge difference. And so it's these nutrients that we're talking about when we say that an oligotrophic lake doesn't have many nutrients in it. It doesn't have much of this in it. And so you don't get much growth in the lake, so that's why it's so clear and pretty. A eutrophic lake has a lot of nutrients in it. And look at all the growth you see. That's all algae growing in the lake. That's a severe case, but that happens. Often what you'll get is these eutrophic lakes form in areas around farms or golf courses that put down a lot of fertilizer. And then when it rains, the fertilizer runs off and pulls all of the nutrients into the lakes.
And you said severe, like, that's bad.
I mean, that thing's covered with algae. Yeah, well, that's going to be a bad thing, because what happens in a eutrophic lake, and they ask this on the AP test, is that all this algae grows because of the fertilizer. And you'd think, hey, a lot of algae, that's a good thing. That's a lot of growth. But then what happens is the algae dies, and it floats to the bottom, and it's consumed by bacteria. And it's called decomposition. The bacteria decompose and consume the dead algae, and that uses up oxygen. And because of this carpet of algae, new oxygen can't get down into the lake. Because the oxygen comes from the air. The oxygen in water comes from the air, where there's a lot of oxygen. So new oxygen can't get down in there, and the lake becomes anoxic. And that's a word you should probably know too. Anoxic. A. If you ever put A in front of a word, it's like abiotic means not biotic. Anoxic means no oxygen. And so there won't be any fish or anything living in this lake. It's a dead lake. Almost all golf course lakes would look like this, to some extent, if they didn't treat their water. But what they do is they put algae killer in the water to kill all this growth of stuff so that the lake looks nice. Most golf courses do something like that. You can go in there and scrape the algae out, but that's really takes a lot of time. There's a friend of mine, her son, he has a whole business where he goes around the golf courses around here and treats the lakes to kill the algae. That's his business. He's got 5 guys working under him. Isn't that a good business? Because you have to have a license to spray the chemicals that kills that algae. And so you can't just, you and I couldn't do it. You have to hire someone. Interesting? You getting ideas for future employment?
Yes, I am.
Good. Finally, this shows turnover that happens in lakes. Now, let's talk about a very deep lake that is in a place where it gets cold. You'll see a very deep lake in a cold area will form layers. An upper layer of the lake that's warm, a middle layer that's kind of medium temperature, and the lower layer of the lake is very cold. You may have even felt this in a small lake if you ever dive down. You know when you dive down and it's real cold at the bottom? You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
See, cold water is heavier and tends to sink. And warm water is lighter and tends to go to the top. So the bottom's going to be colder than the top. However, spring and fall, the temperature can go down at the top. And think about this, if the temperature is cooler at the top, then the top's going to cool off. And what if the top eventually got colder than the layer at the bottom? It would sink and fall down, and you'd have what's called a turnover, an overturn. And the wind helps do this. It's very usually windier in the spring and fall, and the wind will blow and help mix it up. But the cooler temperatures will cool off the water, and it'll fall to the bottom. And you can even get ice form at the top.